The morning mist clung tightly to the steep rocky cliffs of Quebec as thousands of red-coated soldiers silently ascended the narrow, treacherous path. Below them, the dark, freezing waters of the St. Lawrence River drifted quietly past the sleeping French fortress. It was September 13, 1759, and the fate of an entire continent hung precariously in the balance. General James Wolfe stood pale and sickly among his anxious men, knowing that this dangerous gamble would either forge a massive empire or completely destroy his army. The heavy silence was thick with anticipation, broken only by the soft shuffle of leather boots against hard rock and the distant cry of a waking bird. At the very top of the towering cliffs, the French sentries were taken completely by surprise as the British line formed rapidly on the Plains of Abraham. The sudden, unexpected appearance of a disciplined enemy force so close to the city walls sent shockwaves of panic through the defenders. Marquis de Montcalm, the seasoned French commander, rushed to assemble his scattered troops, believing it to be a mere diversion rather than a full-scale invasion. Drums beat a frantic rhythm as white-coated French regulars and indigenous allies poured out of the citadel. The air grew thick with tension as two great powers prepared to clash for the ultimate prize of North America. This dramatic moment was the culmination of years of bloody conflict that had ravaged the frontier from the icy forests of Canada to the humid swamps of Louisiana. Villages had been burned and families shattered in a war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The British sought to expand their colonies westward, while the French fought to connect their northern holdings with their southern ports. Indigenous nations caught in the middle navigated treacherous alliances to protect their ancestral lands. The stakes were nothing less than the future language, culture, and governance of the New World, involving the three greatest powers on the continent. Years before the climactic battle at Quebec, a young Virginian surveyor named George Washington found himself at the center of this brewing storm. He was tall and ambitious, eager to make a name for himself in the British military hierarchy. Washington was sent into the Ohio country to deliver an ultimatum to the French demanding their withdrawal from territory claimed by the British Crown. His journey through the dense wilderness was fraught with danger and diplomatic pitfalls. This mission would inadvertently spark a global conflict that would reshape the map of the world and define his legacy. The interactions between Washington and the French officers were polite on the surface, but underpinned by a steely resolve. The French refused to yield their forts and dismissed the British claims with confident arrogance. Washington returned to Virginia with the news that diplomacy had failed and that force would be necessary to secure the frontier. His report galvanized the colonial governors and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to open warfare. The young officer could not have known that his first command would end in disaster and ignite the 7 Years' War. Determined to assert their claim, the British sent Washington back to the Ohio Valley with a small force to build a fort. However, he discovered that the French had already established Fort Duquesne at the strategic forks of the Ohio River. In a fateful encounter at Jumonville Glen, Washington and his indigenous allies ambushed a French scouting party, killing their commander. This skirmish is often cited as the first shots of the war. It was a chaotic and confused engagement that stripped away any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution between the two rival empires. Retreating from the French response, Washington hastily constructed a small circular stockade he aptly named Fort Necessity in a low-lying meadow. The location was poor, and when the French and their indigenous allies attacked in heavy rain, the British gunpowder turned to useless paste. Trapped and outgunned, Washington was forced to surrender on the 4th of July, 1754. He signed a confession written in French, which he could not read, admitting to the assassination of the French officer Jumonville. This humiliation burned deeply in the young Virginian and taught him hard lessons about warfare. News of the defeat at Fort Necessity traveled across the Atlantic and alarmed the government in London. The British realized that colonial militias were insufficient to dislodge the entrenched French forces. They decided to send regular army regiments to North America under the command of General Edward Braddock. Braddock was a disciplined career officer who believed that traditional European military tactics would easily sweep aside the French and their irregular allies. He arrived in Virginia with great fanfare, expecting a quick and decisive campaign that would restore British honor. General Braddock assembled a massive expeditionary force to march on Fort Duquesne, cutting a wide road through the dense wilderness as they went. George Washington joined the campaign as a volunteer aide, hoping to learn from the professional British soldiers. The march was agonizingly slow as the army hauled heavy siege cannons and supply wagons over rough terrain. The long column stretched for miles, leaving them vulnerable to ambush. Despite warnings from Washington and indigenous scouts, Braddock remained confident in the superiority of his red-coated regulars and their disciplined formations. On July 9, 1755, the British vanguard crossed the Monongahela River just miles from their objective. Suddenly, the forest exploded with musket fire and war cries as French Marines and indigenous warriors launched a surprise attack. The British regulars, accustomed to fighting in open fields, huddled together in confusion, firing blindly into the trees. The invisible enemy picked them off with terrifying efficiency, turning the orderly column into a slaughterhouse. Officers on horseback were primary targets, and chaos reigned as the command structure completely collapsed under the withering hail of lead. General Braddock rode courageously back and forth, trying to rally his panic-stricken men, but he was eventually struck down by a bullet to the lung. George Washington displayed incredible bravery, riding between the lines to deliver orders after other aides were killed. 2 horses were shot out from under him and 4 bullets pierced his coat, yet he remained unharmed. He organized a rearguard action that allowed the shattered remnants of the British army to retreat. The defeat was a catastrophic blow to British prestige and left the frontier wide open to devastating raids. Following Braddock's defeat, a wave of terror swept through the British colonies as the frontier collapsed. With no army to protect them, isolated settlements were attacked and burned by French allied raiding parties. Refugees flooded into the eastern cities, bringing tales of horror and destruction. The colonial governments, paralyzed by internal bickering, struggled to mount an effective defense. It seemed as though the French and their indigenous allies were invincible masters of forest warfare. The British strategy was in tatters, and the war appeared to be lost before it had truly begun. In a desperate attempt to secure their northern flank, the British authorities turned their attention to the Acadian people of Nova Scotia. Fearing that these French-speaking settlers would side with France, the British demanded an unconditional oath of loyalty. When the Acadians refused, the British initiated a mass deportation known as the Great Expulsion. Thousands of men, women, and children were forcibly removed from their homes and scattered across the colonies. This tragic event demonstrated the ruthless measures the British were willing to employ to ensure their dominance in the region. Meanwhile, the French commander Marquis de Montcalm continued to rack up victories against British fortifications. He captured Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario, securing French control over the Great Lakes. His forces moved with speed and precision, utilizing the waterways to outmaneuver the sluggish British armies. Montcalm proved to be a brilliant tactician who understood how to leverage the skills of his indigenous allies. However, tensions began to rise between Montcalm and the Canadian governor regarding strategy and the treatment of prisoners of war. The war reached a new level of brutality with the siege of Fort William Henry in 1757. After a gallant defense, the British garrison surrendered to Montcalm under honorable terms. However, as the British marched away, French allied warriors, frustrated by the lack of plunder, attacked the column. The ensuing massacre became a rallying cry for the British colonies, fueling a desire for revenge. This dark chapter highlighted the cultural clashes and the loss of control that often accompanied wilderness warfare during this violent era. In London, the political situation was shifting as the British government faced the reality of a losing war. The incompetence of military commanders and the lack of coordination between colonies demanded a change in leadership. King George II turned to William Pitt, a charismatic and energetic statesman, to salvage the situation. Pitt became the driving force behind the British war effort, bringing a new strategic vision. He believed that the war for global empire would be won or lost on the battlefields of North America. William Pitt implemented a bold strategy that focused on overwhelming the French with superior resources and naval power. He borrowed massive sums of money to finance the war effort, pledging to reimburse the colonies for their military expenditures. This move secured the enthusiastic cooperation of the colonial assemblies, who raised thousands of provincial troops. Pitt also selected young and aggressive officers to replace the cautious old guard. He committed the full might of the Royal Navy to blockade New France, cutting off supplies and reinforcements from Europe. The tide began to turn in 1758 as the British launched a three-pronged attack against key French strongholds. A massive amphibious force besieged the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. After weeks of heavy bombardment and siege warfare, the fortress fell to the British. This victory was crucial as it opened the waterway to Quebec and deprived the French Navy of its primary base in the North Atlantic. The noose was beginning to tighten around New France. Further west, British forces achieved a significant psychological victory with the capture of Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario. This raid, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet, severed the French supply line to the Ohio country. Without supplies and trade goods, the French could no longer maintain the loyalty of their indigenous allies. The complex network of alliances that the French had built over decades began to unravel. The British were finally learning how to fight in the American wilderness, adopting lighter infantry tactics and utilizing rangers. To the south, General John Forbes led a methodical expedition to finally capture Fort Duquesne. Unlike Braddock, Forbes built a series of fortified depots as he advanced, ensuring a secure supply line. George Washington once again joined the campaign, leading a Virginia regiment. As the British approached, the French realized their position was untenable due to the loss of indigenous support and supplies. They blew up the fort and retreated just before the British arrived. The British rebuilt the site and named it Pittsburgh, securing the Ohio Valley. By 1759, which became known as the Year of Miracles, the British were ready to strike at the heart of New France. The target was Quebec City, the impregnable capital perched high atop the cliffs of the St. Lawrence. General James Wolfe was given command of the expedition. He was a moody and difficult man, but possessed a brilliant military mind. His fleet navigated the treacherous river and landed his army on the Isle d'Orléans just downstream from the city. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation of the war. The siege of Quebec dragged on for months through the summer, causing frustration for General Wolfe. He launched several attacks on the French lines, but was repulsed each time by Montcalm's well-entrenched defenders. The British bombarded the city, reducing much of it to rubble, but the citadel remained defiant. Sickness and the approaching winter threatened to force a British withdrawal. Wolfe fell ill with a fever and dysentery, but refused to give up. He knew that returning to England without a victory would ruin his reputation. Desperate for a breakthrough, Wolfe devised a risky plan to scale the cliffs at Anse-au-Foulon, a lightly guarded cove west of the city. On the night of September 12th, British troops drifted silently downriver in flatboats. They surprised the French sentries and scrambled up the steep goat path, dragging 2 small cannons with them. By daybreak, nearly 4,000 British soldiers had assembled on the Plains of Abraham, a flat plateau outside the city walls. It was a masterstroke of surprise that caught Montcalm completely off guard. Montcalm faced a critical decision upon seeing the British lines forming on the plains. Instead of waiting for reinforcements that were approaching from the west, he decided to attack immediately. He feared that the British would have time to entrench and bring up more artillery. The French army, composed of regulars, militia, and indigenous warriors, charged across the field. The British infantry stood like a red wall, holding their fire until the French were within 40 yards. Then they unleashed a devastating volley. The massive discharge of British musketry shattered the French advance in a single moment. The British troops reloaded and fired again before charging with bayonets fixed. In the chaos of the battle, General Wolfe was struck by 3 musket balls. He lived just long enough to hear that the French were retreating before dying on the field. Across the lines, Marquis de Montcalm was also mortally wounded while trying to rally his men. He died the next day and was buried in a shell crater inside the city. Quebec surrendered days later, effectively ending French power in North America, although fighting would continue for another year. The fall of Montreal in 1760 completed the British conquest of Canada. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, formally ended the 7 Years' War. France ceded all of its territory in mainland North America to Britain and Spain. The British Empire had achieved total dominance, securing a vast new territory that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. However, the victory came at a tremendous financial cost to the British government. The national debt had nearly doubled during the war, and maintaining a standing army in the colonies was expensive. To pay for this, the British Parliament decided to levy taxes on the American colonies, reasoning that they should contribute to their own defense. Acts such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts were passed without consulting the colonial assemblies. This shift in policy caused immediate resentment among the colonists who felt their rights were being violated. Furthermore, the removal of the French threat changed the dynamic between the colonies and the mother country. The colonists no longer needed British protection from a foreign power on their border. They had also gained valuable military experience fighting alongside British regulars and had seen that the British Army was not invincible. Men like George Washington, who had served loyally, now felt slighted by the lack of recognition and the arrogant attitude of British officers. The bonds of empire were beginning to fray. The end of the war also brought conflict with the indigenous nations of the Great Lakes region. The British, unlike the French, refused to engage in gift-giving diplomacy and restricted the sale of gunpowder. In response, a coalition of tribes led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac launched a widespread rebellion, capturing several British forts. The violence convinced the British government to issue the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This infuriated land-hungry colonists who felt they had fought for that land. Thus, the glorious victory that secured British dominance in North America paradoxically sowed the seeds of the empire's undoing. The triumph over France removed the external glue that held the colonies to Britain, while the cost of the war led to the taxation that drove them apart. The soldiers who had marched together at Duquesne in Quebec would soon find themselves on opposite sides of a new conflict. The French and Indian War was not just a struggle for a continent, but the prelude to the American Revolution. As the sun set on the British Empire's greatest triumph, the winds of change were already blowing across the Atlantic. The vast wilderness that had been won with so much blood and treasure would become the crucible of a new nation. The lessons learned in the dark forests of the Ohio Valley and on the heights of Abraham would guide a generation of revolutionaries. Britain had won the world, but in doing so it had set in motion the events that would lose it, the 13 colonies. The whisper of time tells us that every victory carries the seed of a future defeat.